So it's a little bit after 7, and I'm going to start the FinCom subcommittee, the guidelines subcommittee. So my name is Chris Reynolds, and I'm the chair of the guidelines subcommittee. And in order to open the meeting, we'll do a roll call of committee members. And I wish I could find out how to get it on the screen the way it normally is. I'm not seeing the boxes. So
if you go down to participants at the bottom and click that little thing, you should get a pullout on the right.
yeah, that's usually what I have. I see panelists. Yeah, let's see if I push that, if that will help me. No, it's not doing it. Okay, I can see them on my side, so I'm going to try it that way. Okay, so I'm Dick Jamieson.
Here.
John Hickling.
I am here.
Andrea Zoll.
Here.
Ray Andrews.
Here.
Brian Taylor.
Here.
Lois Wassoff.
Here.
Mary Hartman.
Here.
Parashar Patel.
Here.
Wade Rubenstein.
Here.
Okay. I think I got everybody except for myself. So Chris Reynolds and I'm here. Is there anybody that I missed?
Chris, did you call me?
I did
Yeah, I
not.
think
Dee,
you
you're
missed
right.
me.
Yeah. You know why? You're on the big screen. Yeah, I've got you front and center. Dee Ortman.
And you didn't get me either.
Here,
Oh, okay.
here.
Dee's here and Dean Banfield.
I'm here.
Okay, great. All right, so tonight we're going to hear from the folks from the Regional High School Minuteman Vocational Tech. And then we're also going to hear from Stephen Crane in terms of the town. So we're getting an update on financial budgets and information to the extent that they've got it ready for us. And on the so Minuteman is up first, and so just I'll give these folks a second to introduce themselves. We have Steve Ledoux, and he is the representative from Concord on the school committee for the Minuteman Regional Voc Tech, and Bob Doradi is the finance director for that school system. So they have both here to present tonight. We had the materials in advance, which I thank you for. That was very helpful. And I saw that your presentation is very comprehensive. And I guess I would like, as you present, to really think about two things that the committee would like to hear about. It's really the key budget considerations. So I know, Steve, you're the head of the finance committee there. So I think that would help us to know what really were the pros and cons as you went through the budget. And I think the process, telling us where you are, I think you're perhaps mid-process. And then secondly, what the implications are for us in terms of Concord's assessment in FY22, to the extent that you know it, or you can point us in a direction. Those are really the two things we want to come away with. And obviously anything else you feel is important for us to hear. So with that being said, I will turn it over to you. From a committee perspective, what we did last week, and I want to ask, I need input, what we sort of tried to hold questions until the end of the presentation. Did that work for people? Would you like to do it that way, or would you like to change it?
I think it works to hold questions till the end.
Okay.
Worked for me.
Okay.
I would agree because I agree because otherwise the presentations can get bogged down.
That's what I kind of felt. So that I know it's a little difficult, but if you can just make notes and then we'll come to the end. So Bob and Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just say a few introductory remarks and I'll let the finance director take it from there. As the chair indicated, I am the chair of the Minuteman FinCom subcommittee this year. So I was the last man standing. Everybody else got off the committee that was on that committee. So at any rate, we have been since December reviewing budgets from all the department heads or functional areas of the committee. The school superintendent, I think, has gone through 9 iterations of the budget, and we presented a preliminary budget to this entire school committee this past Tuesday night. And we are scheduled to hold a budget hearing on Tuesday, 26th, thank you. Because we are required as a school committee to vote a budget 60 days before the first town meeting of one of our district towns. And Lexington all of a sudden up to the date. So they are doing their town meeting earlier than we anticipated. So all our budget planning and scheduling had to kind of get accelerated because of Lexington. So I know Bob will walk you through that. We have a very modest increase in the operational costs. The lion's share of our increase and the impact on assessment is going to be in capital, particularly the debt for the new school. I think many of you may remember when we've been in front of you before that FY22 was kind of be the big hit, the big year for the debt payment. So that'll be represented in this budget. I don't have the numbers right in front of me of what the Concord preliminary assessment will be, but I know Bob has that. But I will turn it over to him in a sec. But you know, we are very conscious of all our member communities. Some of our member communities are in way tougher financial shape than others. I know one of our member communities is facing an override this spring. So, you know, it's a kind of a delicate balance for us to try to have a affordable budget yet serve all the kids and the operations that we have. So with that, I would turn it over to Bob Doradi, the finance director.
Thank you, Steve. Let me, hopefully I can do the screen share and I can show the presentation. Let me work on that right now. Everybody see the presentation?
Not yet.
Not yet.
It did show up the last time we tried that. Let me try again. Hold on.
Mr. Girardi, oh,
There it is.
Okay.
There we
good.
go.
Okay, good.
And now it looks like a full PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah.
Excellent. So I'd like to thank you and
You're showing it in 2-slide mode. If you can get it into 1-slide mode, that might be better.
oh, you can see
Yeah,
the,
we can see the preview slide, the next slide coming.
Yeah, and your notes that you're going to say too.
Yeah, we got
Yeah,
the notes.
your speaker notes.
presentation. Can you still see the notes?
Yep.
Let me try one more thing. That's when you start a new Skype meeting. I don't want to do that.
Hey, Mr. Girardi.
Yep.
If it would be helpful to you, I'd be happy to be your wingman on this so we could get started. I'm happy to go through the slideshow and share my screen if that would be helpful to you.
Sure, why not?
All right, great.
I'm sorry.
No worries. Happens all the time.
Okay. Excellent. Again, so I want to start off by just thanking you for this opportunity to present Minuteman's reports to the Guidelines Committee. And you've already introduced Steve. I can't thank Steve enough for his leadership, especially in the area of finance and his expertise. We'll jump right into the questions you would ask. The first question you would ask for was to start with budget performance data. So we can go to the next 2 slides, actually. You can skip on to the next 2 slides. And as you can see, this fiscal year 20 budget to actual is running very close. The assessments and Chapter 78 was spot on, but We budgeted conservatively on the Chapter 71 regional transportation. And so as a result, that and the revenues are close to a $435,000 surplus. Our expenditure turnbacks are also close to 400 at 380,000. But that combination of surpluses falls right within our 3 to 4% range. That is our E&D goal each year. And so we have another slide on E&D that we'll touch on this in just a couple of slides. We move on to the next slide, which is the reserve fund activity. You can see our capital stabilization balance is $1,282,629. Creating a healthy capital stabilization fund account was a priority for Minuteman during the construction process because of concerns that MSBA does not fully fund equipment needs of vocational schools. Fortunately, in the 2 years I've been here, I know we've had 2 years of competitive capital skills grants that we've won. 1 year for 500,000, another for 300,000, and I think there were several more before I got here. Those capital skills grants were able to fund those equipment concerns. And so we've been able to repurpose this capital stabilization balance to go towards the fields and reduce the construction costs. So that worked out pretty good for us that we won those capital skills grants. You can see the Opeb trust balance is at $352,028. And again, I have a couple more slides. We're going to talk about Opeb a little later on in the presentation. We can talk a little bit more about that. But you know the history of how much we've been putting in the past. You know, 50,000 for the first 5 years and 60,000 last year. And it's in our budget this year to put another 60,000 in. Next slide. Okay, so certified E&D, as you can see, it has fallen every year over the past 5 years within that 3 to 5% range, which is our policy goal. This year, it's for 2020, it's still estimated. It hasn't been certified yet. So we estimated conservatively at 540,000 for E&D in the July 2020 when it does get certified. Next slide. The COVID impacts on the fiscal year 21 budget have been significant. The expenses for remote learning are still evolving. When we began remote learning, all of our families had internet access. And unfortunately, as this crisis has gone on, some of our families have been financially impacted, and we've had to add expenses for providing remote access. Fortunately, remote access is one of the smaller expenses on this list, but you can see we've incurred significant expenses as a result of COVID on the fiscal year 21 budget. We go on to the next slide. We can see we've actually had some reduced expenses as well in fiscal year 21. As a strategic measure, we reduced 5 FTEs in the fiscal year 21 for a savings of about $275,000. The hybrid model that we are using only has 25% of the students in the building at a time. So we're projecting an estimated $300,000 worth of savings in transportation. And you can see we've actually lost revenue for our revolving accounts. We have many community ed programs that we ran in the summer and during the school year that haven't happened since March. Everything got canceled. And we have had virtually no facility rental income, which has been very significant in the past. And we're projecting it'll be significant in the future, having this beautiful new facility. We should be receiving significant facility rental income once we can get back to having events and hosting events. Next slide. The grant so far, the relief on COVID, the COVID impact so far, as you can see, we received the grants for the reopening grant for $93,000, the DESESers grant, and a school lunch grant of $908. And we have grants that are still in process. We've already received about half of the DESE municipal grants from some of the member districts. So those are still in process. But our hope is to help offset our expenses with these grants. Next slide. On to service level changes. And currently, and for the last several years, we've offered 18 career programs. Our school was built, though, to allow us to expand our majors. And in fiscal year 22, we plan on doing that. With those capital skills funds that I mentioned, we were able to fund a state-of-the-art automated equipment in our warehouse that will be able to expand our engineering program to include logistics automation engineering. Steve and I got to see an amazing presentation on that state-of-the-art equipment that has come in and the warehouse is being installed in the warehouse. The students are going to greatly benefit from what some people at one time thought was futuristic automated technology. Next slide. We brought to you in the past the Minuteman Technical Institute, and it's running well. The good news is that even through the pandemic, they were able to provide remote learning with few delays in the students' completion of their programs, those Chapter 74 programs and the credentials that they received that helped them move on and get careers. We are also, if you notice on the right-hand side of this, we are also applying to the Council on Occupational Education for accreditation. Once we receive accreditation, the most important point on this slide is that it'll allow the students to seek Pell Grants and student loans for their tuition for these programs. So that should really be a boost to this program, and we're in the process. We believe we're going to be getting it soon, our accreditation. Next slide. Budget drivers. We go on to the next, and our school-wide goals are our budget drivers. You know, we're very fortunate that we've had long-term stability in our leadership, our administrative leadership, and because of that, these goals have remained relatively constant, with the priorities being assessed every year. And obviously, currently and for the near future, health and safety have risen to the top of our priority list. But this budget, the funding fiscal year 22 budget, does continue to fund a high-quality career technical education while investing in our goals. So as much as we cut back on this budget, we still feel good about it academically. Next slide. For some of the increased expenses that traditionally we see many of these expenses increase. Obviously, the COLAs and step and lane changes. But what's kind of unique with this new building is that even though our building was built to be more efficient, the increase in capabilities of the building and the increase in the HVAC requirements because of the COVID have increased these expenses significantly, as you can see, 43, 89%. Also, the value of the building is much more than our old building, so even our insurance went up significantly. In my 30 years in this business, I've never seen health insurance go down, but I think it's a combination of the fact that we did reduce a significant number of staff in fiscal year 21, and that will remain in fiscal year 22's budget. I think that, plus a lot of people aren't going to the doctors as regularly as they had in the past because of COVID. And I'm on the health trust, and they're not sure when that's going to change. So we're not seeing the crazy increases we've seen in health insurance as we have in the past. So we're fortunate that we can look at a decrease in our health insurance budget. I've never seen that before. Next slides are about enrollment. So we can go on to the next one. As we have reported in the past, our member district freshman enrollment has increased significantly over the last 3 years. You can see on this slide, the gap between the red and the green continues to grow. And as we're looking at the applications that are coming in this year, it looks like it's going to continue to grow. On the next slide is more detailed information for you. This chart shows the class sizes of member districts. It shows the Concord students at each each class level. It shows that we still have probably one of the highest special ed enrollments in the state. And the total of Concord students is 25. The next slide also shows that Concord's enrollment has been pretty steady over time. You know, there's that significant dip that I think we had with all districts in 12 and 13. But even more amazing is that the last 3 years have been so steady at 25 students. Next slide is the district memberships topic that we want to talk about. And we are going to have the same 9-member district that we had last year, so nothing has changed there. And again, even though our other members' enrollment has been increasing significantly, there's several districts like yourself where it's been pretty consistent. 2 or 3 districts have pretty consistent enrollment, but some of the districts have had significantly increasing enrollment. Next slide are the long-term revenue considerations that you asked us to discuss. The school debt payments will peak. The fiscal year 22 budget funds the final borrowing for the construction project and the borrowing for the field alternates. Decrease in state aid, though, is going to be a concern over the future as our state and country grapple with the economic effects of the pandemic. So that's something to be concerned about as over the next couple of years. I think we're fortunate that Massachusetts has been fiscally prudent, so we were able to get a decent fiscal year 21 budget, but we shall see what the future will bring from the state. The decrease in non-member revenues, that will be a consideration as well. But the corollary to having decreasing non-member revenue is that we will have increasing member revenue, which will increase our state aid. So it does offset a little bit, but strategies that we're going to use to address this are we're going to try and increase our enrollment capacity. Like the fact that we've just gotten all that equipment for the warehouse means that our engineering students, we can have more engineering students if they're working in that new space. So those are ways of increasing enrollment capacity, and we're looking at other ways. Also, in our current budget that we're going to provide you, the increase of current year revenues to provide reductions in member assessments, we now have the opportunity to do that. So we're going to continue to try and maximize the use of prior year revenue and current year revenue to reduce member assessments. Next, we go to per student costs. And if we go to the next slide, this chart identifies the difference between member districts' operating budgets per pupil assessment. Unfortunately, the wealthier communities get hit harder due to the impact of the state required minimum assessments. You know, fortunately, we have softened that by using the 4-year enrollment for calculating the transportation and the remaining operating assessment. So they are, you know, they're not as that far apart, but you do see that Concord's got one of the higher rates because of community wealth. It is what it is. If we move on to the next slide, we go back to talking about the non-member tuition and fees for fiscal year 21. The commissioner set it at 125% of the statewide foundation. So that's $18,400. Other fiscal year 21 fees include the SPED increment, special ed increment, and the capital fee charge. And the sending districts do have to pay their own transportation costs. And we'll have another slide that'll split this out a little bit some more to explain it a little bit more. Why don't we go on to the next slide? You can see that for cities and towns that have less than 5 Chapter 74 vocational programs, they actually get charged a higher capital fee. And for cities and towns that already provide 5 or more Chapter 74 programs, they have a lower fee. So every year we have to calculate that out and figure it out. But as I said earlier, the revenue collected in fiscal year 21 and 22, prior year and current year, will be used to offset debt service assessments to member towns, because we know that that's our biggest increase in our budget. So we're doing everything we can to try and soften that blow as well. Next slide is the OPEB discussion. If we go on to the next So last year, so our current liability is $32,473,201. And last year we had a conversation about the ARC, which was it was formerly called the ARC in the Governmental Accounting Standards 45. Now that we're using Governmental Accounting Standard 75, they call it expense, not ARC, but it's the same thing. I believe last year we reported that our ARC back then was about 2,300,000, 2,200,000. This year, our ARC or expense is $2,942,378. I discussed it a little bit earlier, the history of how much we've been putting into our Opeb reserve fund. But the last bullet point identifies that the Minuteman Finance Committee has made, a long-term funding strategy to repurpose the ESCO debt payments that will be retiring in fiscal 25 to go to Opeb appropriations. And then hopefully we can fund that Opeb reserve fund at a faster rate. That's the game plan. Next slide would be benchmarking slides. And this slide shows the amount of net school spending as a percentage of foundation, and Minuteman is on the lower end among our member districts. If you move to the next slide, as we've shared with you before, our special education expenditures as a percent of the budget is significantly higher, is very high. And the good news here is last year when we presented this data, Minuteman was actually the highest at about 14%, and Keith Tech was at about 11%. This year, Minuteman has gone down significantly in our percent of the budget. So, hopefully we're being more efficient and more frugal in the way that we provide the important services that we do. And we do provide excellent services for our students with special needs. But that's a sign of a trend in the right direction. Next slide. I believe last year you asked for some academic benchmarking as well. And so this chart shows that on the MCAS score comparison, Minuteman was higher than all of those comparable vocational schools. He had the highest score of all of them. So we're very proud of that. If we go on to the next slide, to be fair, if we compare net school spending as a percent of foundation to our vocational comparison districts, we are one of the higher spending districts compared to them, but we are getting the results, which is great. Next slide. This is our ELA MCAS comparison that shows us scoring higher than the state average in meeting expectations in ELA. The next slide is math, where we're scoring a little lower, but still meeting expectations. We're a little lower than the Mass state average, but we're still meeting expectations, which is great. And then the next slide is for the science composite index, and you can see that we're scoring higher than the state average there as well. So I thought I'd add some of that academic data because I know you had requested that last year. The next area, if we go on, is capital spending. You can see our projection for the debt service for Concord. That's based on the assumption that your debt capital assessment share stays around 7.66%. And you can see the actual fiscal year 21 and then the projection for the next 4 years after that. Next slide. We have a couple of projects that we want to share with you and discuss. The athletic fields, you can see the timeline here that we're already starting some of the site and base work, and hopefully construction happens in 2021 and substantial completion in October of 2021. You did ask in your questions to talk about sustainability. And when we were working on this, one of the things that we knew we had to do was to have put aside $168,000 in a supplemental allocations and stabilization fund every year, so that we can we'll get those funds through our field rental, because we know that we annually we get that, at least that much or more. And then that will provide for the 10-year turf replacement cycle so that it will be sustainable. What we're building will be sustainable. And that's our goal. The next project is something that's, if you go to the next slide, is a photovoltaic installation. And this is something that we've been working on to secure our LEED certification as part of the MSBA project for the construction building. And what happens is that actually helps provide us more reimbursement from MSBA to the tune of $2 million, although that's not like it's not extra. It's something that we've been counting on doing. But the LEED points that you get for a photovoltaic installation are significant, and this will definitely guarantee that we'll get the appropriate reimbursement we've been looking for. Again, you can see that there's a timeline starting in January. Hopefully, we're going to get approval, and then by fall it'll be operating. And as far as sustainability, technically it's a 20-year lease purchase, so any of the maintenance or any of the problems with it have to be paid for by the company that we're working with, and we will get net electric savings of approximately $20,000 to $30,000. So it should be a sustainable project. It's no money out of our pocket. It saves us money on our MSBA reimbursement, and it saves us money on electrical savings. So we're excited about that project as well. And then I think the last slide is just a thank you. So if you have any other questions about the slides or any other questions you'd like to ask, I'd be happy to share them with you.
Bob, this is Chris. Can you talk about enrollment a little bit? So I know that's always been important. So we have a certain size classes that you can fit in the school. And at one point they were oversubscribed. Do you still have a waiting list for students? And where are you now in terms of I guess I need to speak maybe ex-COVID, but I'm trying to understand because that has a big implication for us in terms of what percentage of the school we have in students. So I'm just trying to understand what the size is in terms of enrollment in a normal year. How many students can you have in?
So we're working on it. I'm looking to see if I can find a spreadsheet that Dr. B was working with as far as we're looking at about, I think the last couple of years, we've enrolled about 85 students roughly. And we're looking at that or possibly 200 with some of the extra capacity that we're trying to build into the building. We still have a waiting list. We had a waiting list for this last year, and I am working on some slides that will show that we have even more applications this year. So it's probably certain that we'll have a waiting list this year. As far as the slot allocation, that's a process that goes before the school committee. And that's
Right.
I was hoping to find that document, but it shows the percents. Let me see if I can find it. It shows the percent and the number of students from each community. If I can't find it right now, I'll certainly send it to Steve and he can send it out to you, and it'll show you the number of slots that we're looking at for each.
Right. So if maybe 25 or 30 more, you think?
Oh, I'd like to give you something more accurate than that.
Okay, that's all right. That's fine.
If I can find it. I'm trying to move my screens around so I can get to I'm certain I can find it in my emails.
That's all right. You can send it to me. That's all right. Parashar, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Robert, two questions. On slide 3, did I see correctly that there was an operating deficit for fiscal year 20, or did I not get that correct?
Slide 3. No, there's not a deficit. There won't be a deficit. We are projecting an EAD of about 540, possibly more.
Okay, I must have misread the numbers on slide 3 with the revenue and costs. I have a question on the COVID grants. Are they automatic? In other words, do you have to actively go out and apply for the grants, or the state actually distributing them down automatically? That's sort of one question.
So to answer that, the Department of Education, for those couple of grants are, it's an application process that we go through similar to our Title I application. So there is paperwork to fill out, there's paperwork to identify what we're spending it on, and then there's also quarterly reports to identify that we are spending it down and that we have true expenses there.
Sure.
So it's quite a process.
So it sounds like there's an application process. I'm kind of curious, have you sat down, at least for Concord, with Concord Public Schools and the Concord Carlisle High School to see and make sure that all the schools are receiving the same type of grants? I don't know to what extent, Frank, I thought they were all K-12 generally in the federal stimulus bills. So theoretically, everybody should be receiving at least the same type. I understand the amount should be different. I'm just kind of curious, have we gotten the full amount, have we gotten all the grants that were due? That's the question, both to you, and I guess, I don't know how we pose this question to the schools. It didn't occur to me to ask this last week when they came to us.
Yeah, well, we're fortunate that the business managers actually have a listserv. So we all know that we're all working on the same things and we're doing the same thing. And I know your district applied for the very same grants. They went through the process. And, you know, we would like a little bit more funding. And the good news is with the stimulus package, it looks like they funded the schools some more, but we haven't heard exactly how much.
Yeah.
The unfortunate news is the current stimulus package didn't help municipalities out, but I think that there's a hope that there'll be another stimulus package coming out that will help municipalities. Because I know the municipalities really have a lot of need too. So I know that your district, your school district has been applying for the very same grants we have, and that we're hopeful that there'll be a little bit more to help offset some of these expenses.
Okay, thank you.
Mary?
Hi, thanks for that presentation. I have two questions. The first question is, I wonder if you could help me understand what you mean by minimum local contribution, because I've been working under the erroneous assumption that the assessment to the towns was simply your operating budget spread out by the number of students we had enrolled, but I guess it's more complicated. That's my first question. And my second question is, I wonder if you can help me understand how you're able to add 2 new majors in FY22 and yet reduce your head count by 5.
Okay. So let me start off with the first question, which is the Minuteman assessment formula is probably one of the most complicated ones I've seen. And there is, all districts have a state mandated municipal contribution and that minimum requirement assessment. Now we talked about the percent over the minimum required that we spend, you do as in your schools and we do in our school. And so what we've done to help soften that blow as a regional district, because we do realize that our different communities have different resources. And so there is a state minimum required amount that has to be based on a certain part of the formula for our assessment formula. And when you get our budget book, you'll be able to see there's a page that's a fold out page because it's so long. And you'll be able to see the state minimum required assessment. But then what we did was, as part of our updated regional agreement, is that we based some of the other expenses like the transportation assessment and the total operating remaining assessment, because we are over net school. We based that on a 4-year rolling average. And that really helps some communities when they have a spike. Now, the nice thing for Concord is you've been so stable that your assessment is not going up very much this year. You know, even though we are going to, it will go up, everything goes up, but it's not going to go up as much as a lot of the other districts. So I think that answers the first question. I'm trying to remember, what was the second question again?
How can you add 2 new majors in FY22, but you've got a reduction in your head count?
Well, so Dr. Quillen was very good about looking at where he could save money. I mean, some of those reductions are in paraprofessionals, some of them are in clerical. And the majors aren't adding teachers per se. It's about the courses that kids can take. So now we have extra courses in automation that we couldn't provide when we didn't have a warehouse. So, we did not add staff. We reduced staff, but not necessarily teaching staff. Although I think through attrition, we may have reduced 1 or 2 teaching staff as well, but the other reductions were clerical and paraprofessional.
Thank you.
Dean?
Is my mic on? Yeah. So I have 2 questions. The first was, you had mentioned that your rental income is fundamentally flatlined because of COVID. And since you're in a new building, you had an expectation that it would be more than it was in the old building. What was it in the old building, and kind of what do you think it'll be as a contribution to your income sources when we get out of the other side of COVID? That's my first question.
Yeah, I would have to look that up as far as what it was, because a lot of that predates me. I've only been here for 2 years, so I've been working under the new building. I would have to look that up, but we do believe that we have significant revenue to come in. I believe, Steve, we've seen some presentations where it was anywhere between $300,000 and $450,000 worth of revenue.
Yeah.
Because we are going to have, and that's really just field revenue. We haven't been able to have revenue from our gym, which has been a significant source, and we now have a beautiful gym. We have a beautiful theater that's going to bring in quite a bit of revenue, state-of-the-art, impressive theater. So there's a lot of untapped potential in this new building, and it's been really frustrating to start the school year off in the new building and then have to go to remote learning and a closure. It's been hard to estimate what expenses are going to be. Like, I shared with you the utilities. And moving forward, it's hard to estimate until we get a good year under our belt, so we have some trends. But I don't think we can give you the definite numbers, but we can tell you that we've actually had outside agencies do assessments of what they think the revenue is going to be, and it's going to be quite strong.
Yeah, there's the ability, given the new building, to have host conferences, so they can be like conference centers for corporate entities. And catering is also one of the big hits in the revolving funds, where typically kids have been catering functions all around the area, and they're not been able to do that this year.
Okay, well, that answers the revenue question. So my other question is on your debt slide 37. I presume that all the debt has been issued at this point. The building is up and running, and the debt is what it is. But the debt continues to, the service continues to rise. Is that because of the tail of the communities who are backing away from the table and have left the district? Is that why it's going to keep going up for several years? Is that why?
That's part of it. Part of it is, well, first of all, we haven't done all the borrowing yet. This
We
year,
haven't. Okay, all right.
yeah, in our fiscal year 22 budget, we're projecting borrowing $3.8 million for the final borrowing, and some borrowing for the fields. So, but that's not part of the capital. But
I
the
thought that was kind of a wash, but
borrowing
fields were,
still
yeah,
has one
it's a
more year
different
of
deal.
doing it. So that's why you're going to see that go up again. And then, like you said, part of it is the member enrollment, the share of it. If your member enrollment stays steady, then you should see less increases. Whereas other districts who have significant increases, they'll see more. So part of it is that as well.
Thank you.
Okay. I have a couple other questions, Bob. So if you, I just want to talk about where you think we are on the assessment now. So I think if I read the tea leaves, maybe we're up somewhere, around 100,000. Is that where we're going to be up?
it looks like 75,000.
75,000, okay. And when you do your analysis of your charges per student, and you say you use operating, so that's without the foundational level that the state applies?
No, unfortunately, it includes that foundational piece, and that's part of the operating expenses. There's the foundation piece, and then there's the remaining operating assessments and the transportation assessment. So it's multiple things that are involved.
Okay,
What I
So-
did include was debt, because some of the communities have excluded debt, some of them haven't. So I didn't go like
Yeah.
the overall budget, because I thought that might not be an apples to apples comparison. Does that make
yeah,
sense?
Concord, I believe, has excluded the debt associated with the building. But if we're somewhere around 1.3 million and I back out what I think the debt assessment is going to be, I think I'm around 850 for non-debt expenses.
Are very close, 839.
Okay, so that number over 25 students is something like 34,000, right?
Yeah, so I used the state foundation enrollment, and I was debating whether I should use the 25 or the foundation enrollment does include the post-secondary students, so it's actually 29.
Oh, yeah, because 29 is the number I always thought. I was surprised when I saw the 25.
Yeah.
Okay,
25 are the,
so that's the difference between what you have on that chart.
yeah. So you're right on target.
Okay. 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 You came to us not too long ago to ask for some additional funds related to the athletic fields. I think that number was 45,000 or somewhere around there. Where is that number? Is that number included in the current year assessment, or is that on top of our assessment?
So as part of the borrowing for the field, the alternate field borrowing is included in the assessment. But it's included, I would have to show you in, when we get you the revenue page, you would see it's listed with our capital equipment and leases. Because we wanted it separated out. We didn't want to keep it in debt, building project debt, because you are excluding your debt, but you can't exclude the funding of that field, because that wasn't included in your debt exclusion. So it is in the budget. It's one of the increases that's pretty significant in capital equipment and leases. When you do get our budget book, and you see the revenue page, you'll see that. Well, as Steve said, our operating budget's only up like 2.4%, 2.35%, but our capital equipment and leases is up 67%, and our building project debt is up 26%. So those are where the increases in the budget came, and which is why we worked so hard at reducing the operating budget over the course of 9 versions of this budget.
Okay, so the 75,000, if that's the increment to the assessment, that's it. I'm not looking for anything on top of that.
Correct.
Okay, I understand that. This is a question for either you or Steve. So from a, let's see how I'll say this, from a comfort perspective, right? So you're pretty underfunded on OPEB. The E&D is lower. Your stabilization reserve is pretty much all called for, right? You're going to spend that on the fields. It looks pretty tight to me in terms of the budget, which I understand may be where we are. Are you worried at all about, do you have any contingency elsewhere that I'm not seeing here?
Well, I can add that we did increase our allocation to the stabilization fund. In the past, it was 90 to 100,000. This year, it'll be 350,000 to kind of give that a boost again. Because it is a tight budget, but we do believe in preparing for the worst. So I appreciate you noticing that. But we in this budget that we're providing, we are going to allocate about 350,000 to the stabilization fund.
Okay. Does any of that E&D go in to support the, are you using E&D to support the operating budget?
Every year we'll use current year E&D to some degree. This year we're using about 540 of it.
is that all of it, or
We hope that it should come in a little higher than that because, but 540 was a conservative estimate. It's what we put aside about 540 of our E&D towards the operating budget every year.
so does that leave you with no E&D after that, no balance after that?
Just with a small balance, but it should be
Okay,
added.
so you really don't have a lot of reserves?
No.
Okay.
Can I follow up on that question? So your annual practice is to take the previous year's E&D and basically allocate it towards your budget? Is that the way I'm understanding that?
Correct.
Okay. And so and then as you manage your budget, you hope to generate some additional E&D in order to push towards the next fiscal.
We have a history of being able to do that, yes.
Yeah, okay. Got it.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions for Steve or Bob? Yeah. Wait.
Yes, Bob, I have just a couple quick questions. Teacher salaries represent what percentage of your budget, your operating budget, do you know?
I was just looking at that slide. I think last year it was right around, believe it or not, 50%. This year it's even a little less, believe it or not.
Okay. And where are you in the budget site or in the negotiating cycle for the teacher's contract?
I can answer that because I'm also on the negotiation subcommittee. We're in our first year of a 3-year contract this fiscal year. So next year's budget will be the second year of a contract.
Okay, thank you.
I think Wade, you had a question.
Robert, just on the capital allocation, is the formula similar to the per capita allocation? How does that work out?
The capital allocation is a little different because as part of the agreement for the members that left, they still have to pay a portion of the capital debt, especially for ESCO. And so we have to figure out their portion of ESCO because when they left, that was an obligation they had. So it gets quite complicated. And their enrollment is frozen at when they left. That was the agreement. But, and so what we've seen is that the increasing member district enrollment has actually decreased the expense for those who left because now our members are taking on a bigger portion of that ESCO debt. But the debt is based on the 4-year rolling average, which again, we were talking about those different factors. So that makes it a little fairer, and it makes it also makes districts less susceptible to spikes by having a 4-year rolling average. So it is a pretty complicated formula. We do have that also in the back of our budget book. So when we bring those to you, you can look at the formula. But again, because we have former member districts who owe money for the ESCO debt, it makes it a little bit more complicated.
Bob, at one time, we were hoping to get some other towns to join. Any update on potential new members?
Well, that's not my area. Dr. McQuillan really focuses on membership. And, I mean, I know that we have some non-member districts that have significant numbers of students. It would make sense for them to become members, but I don't know where we are in that process.
Okay. I think I saw another hand, or is everybody good? Is it Phil? Did you know? D.
D. Robert, you go by Bob?
Yeah.
Bob. Bob, for the upcoming year, what are your 2 or 3 major financial concerns?
Utilities. I think I shared with you the slide. I am shocked at how expensive those utilities are. And yet I do understand, and this isn't my first building project. I've been in other districts where we had building projects. And it was kind of explained to me, you have this LEED certification and you're much more efficient. You have all the best of everything. But the reality is that you're using more than you ever used because you have newer equipment, more equipment than you had. And so that's a major factor in why the utilities would have jumped so much, but that's been, the one that's been most concerning for all of us here.
I think the other piece with the utilities is because of COVID, the whole circulation systems are going all the time, even though there's not as many kids in the building and things like that, because you just got, circulation's the whole key to the thing. So that's a big driver, I think. I mean, I know Dr. McQuillan the other night said he wanted to, dive deeper into why the utility costs are so high, but that probably is one of the factors.
Brian.
Hey, Bob, just one question for you. You had mentioned you had significant number of non-member districts. Do you know what that number is? We have 9 member districts, but how many non-member districts do you actually have?
I can pull that up. Let me pull up a spreadsheet. An enrollment spreadsheet for this.
And I guess what prompted my question is page 25, which talks about sort of the capital fee for non-member town students. There's a split between, whether they have less than 5 or more than 5. I'm just curious to know what the split between the non-member and member unit districts might be.
So let's see. There's about 30 non-member districts. And most of them, I would say 10 of them are the smaller districts that pay the higher rate. The other ones are bigger districts who just don't have the programs that kids want in their district. So they send them to us.
Okay, thanks.
But just to clarify for Brian, the number 5 has to do with what VOC programs are available in the district that's sending the kids in. It doesn't have to do with how many kids are being sent from that district. It's like if you offer 5 VOC programs, like Concord Carlisle offers very few, if any. But if you're, say, you're Newton or someplace which has a very large, system, they may offer many VOC programs. And then you pay if you offer more than 5 VOC programs within your district, and the kid still needs to come to Minuteman because you don't have what he wants, then they pay a lower rate. That's how that thing works to try to help with that. Have I got that right, Bob?
Absolutely correct. Yes. And also districts who are members of other vocational schools, they're considered 5 or more. So I was in a former district, a small town that didn't have vocational programs, but we were a member of ASPET. But at that time, we had a student who wanted to go to a Minuteman program that ASPET didn't offer. So we were one of those districts who paid tuition to send, and we didn't have, but we would have paid, at that time, we didn't have to pay the capital, but we would have paid the lower fee because we were members of ASPET.
Right.
Very few, but there's a small number of districts that aren't members of vocational districts, and they don't offer them in-house either. And as you pointed out, Dean, there are some big districts that have their own vocational schools within their district, but they just don't offer the same programs.
And Bob, it's still your intention to offset member assessments with non-member tuition. Is that correct? Because at one point there was some discussion about ending that, but we're still doing that.
We're still doing that, and now that we will have current year and prior year tuition that we're using. So we're doing it to the maximum of our ability to try and smooth this out.
Yep. Okay. Okay. Any other questions for Bob or Steve? Okay. Looks pretty good. Thank you very much for joining us and for your very helpful presentation.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Appreciate it.
Yep, thank you. Have a good
Thank
night.
you.
Good night.
Okay. So next up, we have, I guess it's Stephen. Yep, I see Stephen. So we're
Hi,
going
good
to hear
evening.
about the town budget.
Sure. So I guess, and Carrie, you're going to share the screen for the presentation.
I am.
So Carrie and I are going to kind of co-present this. I think she'll run through some of the details and I can give some of the background. But I think I would start by saying, and I think you heard this from the superintendent last week, there are a lot of unknowns that are going to have an impact on our budget. I think not the least of which is local receipts and state aid. We do expect property taxes to still be strong and stay that way, because I do think, over the next year or so, the downward trend of the economy should flatten out a little bit, and then hopefully things will start to rebuild. So I do think that we are still taking a very conservative approach. I think Carrie will show you what we're looking at in terms of the town manager's budget message that went out to department heads last week, calling for basically level funding, funding non-discretionary, non-discretionary costs at actual, and then level funding discretionary costs at the FY21 level. So like last year, like the revised FY21 budget that we worked on in September, we are taking a conservative approach because we don't want there to be a steep drop off, one year to the next. We were hoping to soften that impact of COVID-19 and the effect on receipts. So with that, I'd ask Carrie to kind of take us into the presentation.
Thank you, Stephen, and good evening. We've put together a presentation for you based on your information requests that you sent out to us in July. You asked us to address budget performance, litigation, labor costs, historical FTEs, revenue projections, our budget drivers and service status, and any changes to that OPEB capital and benchmarking. So we did send out a more detailed handout yesterday, and we've used that to compile some slides. So there really isn't any new information in here, but in terms of the budget performance for fiscal 19 and 20, we did end both of those years with a surplus. In 19, we ended with about 2.5%, or about $619,000. In 20, we ended with $715,000, which was 2.7%. And you might recall that we actually went through a process to recapture that surplus and carry it forward to fiscal 21 to offset the fiscal 21 budget. In fiscal 19, the largest factor contributing to the surplus was position vacancies. In fiscal 20, it was both position vacancies and prolonged closures due to the pandemic, such as the closure of the library and the senior center. For fiscal 19, what we did was we identified what we called significant variances, and we presented this information to you last year. And the way that we identified significant variances were we looked at anything that was either 5% above or below what the budget was, or $10,000. And then we specifically identified any of the deficits. And really the things that stand out in fiscal 19, these are no surprise. We had a deficit in legal of about $280,000. And we were able to cover that through an departmental year-end departmental transfer and a transfer from the reserve fund. The other variances in fiscal 19 were fairly insignificant. The next largest one would be debt service. We had a pretty large surplus in debt in our debt service at the end of fiscal 19 of $291,000. And that was because we had a very large premium for the bond issue that we did that year. And so we encumbered that money and we were able to use that to offset fiscal 20 debt. So then as we were working through this presentation, we thought we would start, since we've sort of established this trend of identifying variances of 5% or more than $10,000, we started doing that for fiscal 20. And honestly, I could have filled up probably 3 slides with all of the variances because of things that happened. So we stepped back and said, let's just pull out the things that, the variances that weren't attributable either to vacancies in positions or prolonged closures because of COVID. And so what stands out when you back out all of those other things, again, a deficit in legal, which you're very much aware of $287,000 that we cured through a year-end transfer. We had a deficit in facilities of $119,000 that we were also able to cure through an interdepartmental transfer. And or some of that deficit was covered by the CARES Act. And the CARES Act, as you likely know, is the federal money that we're receiving to help us with pandemic expenses. And the facilities overages really have to do with additional cleaning that needs to be done to meet the protocols, the pandemic protocols for returning to the office, or we have PPE that we have to purchase. So it's really related to cleaning, and also the purchase of different air filters and purification systems and that type of thing.
Yeah.
Then the other deficit was in public safety, about $340,000. And again, this is related to pandemic response, and it's either covered either by FEMA, which covers 75% of eligible public safety expenses, and typically in an emergency, the local government then has to pick up the 25% share. But fortunately, the CARES Act, one of the eligible allocations of CARES Act funding is the 25% share that's remaining from FEMA. And the expenses, additional expenses in public safety for pandemic response really have to do with how we're managing the fire department. You know, we operate out of 2 stations, and typically if we need to fill slots at the fire department because people are taking vacation or they're out sick, we allow members that are stationed maybe at the West Concord station, they can pick up a shift at the center station. But because of the pandemic and trying to keep the shifts separate, we're not allowing that to happen. And so that's creating some additional need for overtime because there are more spots that need to be filled.
If just a quick note, Carrie, on and just a reminder to the Finance Committee that this was really the period between, say, beginning of March to June 30th that we're really talking about. And one of the key things for facilities was, I think when I presented the budget last year, we had talked about consolidating building maintenance line items under the facilities department and giving facilities more control over those expenses in a centralized way. We had said we have a goal of consolidating custodial services, but because of the different ways people had custodial care, we couldn't do it in the FY20 budget. The FY21 budget proposal. However, the pandemic really required us to then do that. And so because the facilities department ended up basically taking over managing contracted cleaning services, as well as bringing on additional cleaners. And this is a time where, we didn't really understand about contact, surface contact, transmission and things like that. So we went over the top to keep our employees safe, especially our essential buildings. And that wasn't budgeted, but they took it over. And I'll give you one example where one of our contracted cleaning services stopped operating when everything shut down. And so we had to add service to keep one of our buildings clean. And so now one of the offshoots of all of this is the FY22 budget should really reflect a more consolidated facilities division. But we did end up adding you may recall in the amended FY21 budget, we did add custodial care. So, and Carrie's right about the shift, the no commingling of shifts in the fire departments. And like I said, we went out and were aggressive in purchasing PPE when we saw there were shortages. And there may be some expenses that weren't reimbursed because at the time what CARES Act was going to pay for was and has been a moving target. But that's something that we were fortunate. I think we got a pretty high rate of reimbursement on most of our expenses.
So this slide is just a summary of budget to actual for fiscal 19-20 and the fiscal 21 budget by our major divisions. And then again, down here at the bottom, you can see, you know, we closed the year, and then we have to make an allowance for encumbrances for items that are in transit at the end of the year. And then our net return to free cash in fiscal 19 from budgetary operations, and then the same for fiscal 20. You may wonder, why is fiscal 20 an even number? Because we knew that we would have something to carry forward into 21, and we had a process to do that. Earlier in the planning process, we had to pick a number, and so we had to close to that number. So just so we wouldn't mess with the fiscal 21 budget process. So next we wanted to talk about litigation expense. As you know, the town is a party to two very complicated lawsuits, the Estabrook Woods suit and Nagog Pond. Estabrook Woods is funded through the general fund, and Nagog is funded through the Water Enterprise Fund. In fiscal 21, we appropriated $344,585 to the general fund for legal expenses. So this would be general fund legal expenses plus the Estabrook lawsuit. Through November, which was the most recent billing, when I put this together, we had spent about $253,000. Just yesterday, we received December, and our December bill actually was our lowest bill of the month of the fiscal year. So that was good news. But of the $253,000 expenditure to date, almost $153,000 of it is for Estabrook. $54,554 is for general legal. And so that's everything from town meeting to the planning board needs some assistance because they're reviewing a development application.
Open record requests have been significant. We've had a significant number of open record requests that need legal review that have driven some of that cost up. In terms of the litigation, there was a closure of the trail shortly after the start of the pandemic that generated some unanticipated legal expense in FY21. And there's a number of labor issues that came up related to the pandemic, and the FFCRA and some other law changes related to COVID-19 that needed some analysis as well. So it's been a very busy year for legal services across all fronts, not just on Estabrook litigation. And I think you have a follow-up slide that has some information about NAGOG. But the big thing on NAGOG, I don't know if that is that. I think that's on the next one, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So just to finish up with this slide, so when we put the fiscal 21 budget together, we assume that about 150 to 200,000 of it would be for the Estabrook Woods litigation, and the balance of about $145,000 would be for general legal. Based on our spending to date, we would expect that the fiscal 21 legal appropriation will be overexpended by $100,000 to $200,000. So we will have to come up with a plan to address. In terms of the fiscal 22 budget, as Stephen mentioned, we are just in the beginning of our budget development process, but we expect that the recommended appropriation for legal for fiscal 22 will be at least what it is for fiscal 21.
Yeah. If I can, I think Dean, you're the liaison to the observer for the select board, right?
Oh, I am.
Oh, you are, Mary. Sorry, Mary. That's right. The chair is always the observer. I don't. Mina Macarius, the town council, did make a presentation to the board at its last meeting about our legal services budget. That was I think, pretty detailed. So if you haven't seen that, I'd recommend you go back and just, it was not a long presentation. So you get a lot of good detailed information about where things are. I think in that presentation, it was noted that the trial has been delayed from February to June, which will affect when some of the trial costs are incurred.
So this slide actually pulls out some of the information that town council presented to the select board at that meeting. I won't go through it in detail. I think the point here is that we had a budget of about $150,000 to $200,000. There's about $90,000 worth of expenses that were unanticipated as a result, mostly of the closure of the trail and the preliminary injunction. Again, that weren't anticipated at the time that budget was put together.
Yeah, and I think I do want to touch in not only on Estabrook, but on non-Estabrook. I do want to touch on the planning board, just philosophically. And this is, the preliminary injunction for Estabrook is a good example of this, but many times we spend a lot of money on legal fees to avoid litigation. And so when something like a project or something like that we know is going to be controversial comes up, we have town council get involved pretty early. And what we have found is most times that helps avoid significant litigation costs later, but it does drive up the legal services budget in the short term. And I think, as you're seeing, we can't always prevent litigation, but we do. A lot of those expenditures are intended to be preemptive.
And Stephen, I don't know if you had anything additional that you wanted to say on NAGOG.
So yeah, so NAGOG, I think we were about 60,000 or so into the preparation and the arguments before the Supreme Judicial Court, which happened, I think, in November. And then there's another 63,000 related to legal review of permitting applications for an intake project that we're working on at NAGOG Pond with the town of that's permitted by the town of Acton. And the Littleton Water District is proposing a bedrock well near NAGOG Pond, and so there's a lot of legal review in developing comments on that permit application to Mass DEP. So those are the cost drivers for NAGOG now, but as the presentation notes, that's borne by the Water Enterprise Fund.
So then you had asked for some information on labor cost trends and collective bargaining. The town has 6 unions identified here on the slide. Each of them has a current contract, either expiring at the end of this fiscal year or fiscal 22. The highway and grounds and the 2 library groups just entered into 1-year agreements just recently within the last month or so.
Yeah, if I can comment on that, Carrie.
Sure.
I think what you'll see is if you talk to other finance committees in other communities, I know I'm on a communication thread with a number of area managers, and many communities, in light of the uncertainty of the economic impact of the pandemic, worked with their collective bargaining units on 1-year agreements, which is definitely a non-traditional approach, but we are in, as everyone knows, non-traditional times. And I think it was a good faith measure, both on the part of the town and on the part of collective bargaining units, to say no one wants to commit to increases, either commit to not having any increases or commit to increases that won't be sustainable if the impact on revenues persists. And so that's the approach we took. And I give credit to the collective bargaining units that we negotiated with, those 1-year deals with. They were understanding of the town's position, and I think they saw the bigger picture as well. So I don't know that our bargaining position is going to be much better, come July 1st, 2021. But at least we were able to get through this first year.
So we do expect the overall salary increase for fiscal 22 to be something less than 3%. But again, we're early in the budget process. You asked for a summary of personal expense for fiscal 19-20 and budget for 21. And I have provided that in the down here at the bottom of the slide. I think what's difficult here is we've had so many different things going on in the past year, in the past couple of years. In fiscal 19, we had one contract that was more than 2 years out of date. We had a couple of other contracts that were in holdover. And so we had a big salary reserve budgeted to fund that year plus all of the prior years. So we had a very large salary reserve in fiscal 19. And if you look at the actual or going into fiscal 20, the actual was about 9.9%, but that was cumulative of with one group more than 2 years worth of retro that was owed. We've also had an awful lot of retirements. And so if we look at those numbers and scrub them to take out the retros from prior years and the vacant positions, the trend is more like in fiscal 19, the expense was up 2.2%. In 20, it was up 2.33%. And in 21, it's budgeted at 2.5%, and hopefully will come in pretty close to that. Now, again, these are a little lower than what you might see because of the attrition. You know, in some cases, we have people retiring, the new person coming in at a salary that's fairly similar to what the person retired at, but in other cases, you have people coming in at salaries that are quite a bit less. So there definitely is some masking going on here, and we really would need to look at a larger number of years to flesh out a trend.
A question about the labor trends. The school for several years now, 2 or 3 years now, has offered early retirement programs to their staff in order to try to mitigate sort of a bulk of more senior people in the school systems, and then they can replace those with more mid-level teachers to try to save money. Is there any thought given to that kind of a program at the town side?
So we've given that some thought. I think it has, because of the structure of the compensation of teachers through their contracts, and they have lanes and steps
Right,
and
steps
things
and
like
lanes,
that.
et cetera, yep.
The nature of seniority with teacher contracts makes it so the more senior teachers are much more highly compensated in many cases than the new teachers. I think in the case of town employees, as Kerry noted, especially in the non-union environment, it's more market-based. And so to get quality people to important positions, you have to, kind of be at where the market is. And so I don't see the savings. We have in our internal discussions about it. Now, granted, we haven't run an analysis, but in our discussions with our human resources director and the finance department, on its face, we don't see a real great opportunity for that would really save any money, because in most cases you'd still have to refill the position, and so you'd be paying an incentive and then still spending the money.
Thanks.
So then in terms of headcount and, are we projecting additional positions in the fiscal 22 budget? The departments will be submitting their requests to the town manager at the end of this month. At this time, we're anticipating a request for additional staffing in the library to account for the expansion project, potentially in facilities. But in facilities, that might be partially offset by fee for service. So we have been growing our facilities department over the last several years, which you'll see in the next slide. In some instances, we're able to offset either through services that are provided to an enterprise fund or potentially to other entities that that rent space from the town and that type of thing. So we do have 10 years worth of data for you on the next slide. You know, one of the issues that we really struggle with is recruitment and retention. Currently, we have about 15 vacant FTEs. That's about 6.2% of our workforce. Over the last several years, we've had a position vacancy rate from 5 to 10% and have had a pretty significant turnover in newer people coming in with 5 years or less tenure. You know, definitely newer employees don't have the same commitment to staying with one organization. We have a lot of different operations here where people can go back and forth between public sector and private sector, which a lot of governments don't really have to deal with that. We do here, you know, with the Beatty Center, with recreation, with the light plant. We have a big engineering staff. So we have a lot of people that can easily go back and forth between public and private. We've talked to you before about the fact that, you know, our health insurance, the employer contribution to health insurance is lower here than what employees, public sector employees are typically used to seeing. And there's really a perception out there that Concord's benefits aren't what you typically would see in a government benefit package. You know, I would argue with that, but it is perception. So that is something that we struggle with as well. We do feel that our salaries are very competitive, but again, the health insurance is something that seems to keep coming up. We've done a lot of different things to be creative with our health insurance. We offer a high deductible plan, and we have an employer contribution to the health savings account to kind of ease the financial burden of health insurance. We do have in the current budget funding to hire a consultant to assist us with the detailed classification and compensation analysis. Actually, that was in the budget last year. We carried that funding forward. With the whole COVID-19, that project hasn't gone anywhere, but we are hoping to get that one back on track. We're also in the process of updating our diversity recruitment strategy, giving particular emphasis to outreach to traditionally underrepresented candidates.
So one of the things, just a quick point, one of the areas that is a part of this is a work environment. And so I don't know, you know, we want to make sure that money isn't the only solution for recruitment and retention. You know, remote work really didn't exist as a thing a year ago. And then we spent months where most of the organization was doing only remote work. And so one of the things we're working on as kind of a look ahead is what aspects of that can we retain to make the work environment something that is more favorable and will get people to either want to come work here and stay, or get the people who are here already to want to commit longer term. Because I think most of you know that a more flexible work environment is more appealing, especially to people who are earlier in their careers. So that's something that, you know, we're looking at as kind of a non-financial way to kind of get at this recruitment and retention problem.
So this is our 10-year FTE chart. You can see we've had some pretty significant growth in the organization over the 10 years, but particularly in fiscal 15, the growth here is in public safety. This is when we brought on the first shift of the ambulance in West Concord in fiscal 15. We had additional growth in or large growth in 19 and 20. And, you know, we have growth in 20 up here in general administration. This is with the implementation of our facilities department. So we had a custodial staff, and that has transitioned to having a facilities staff. So we do have tradespeople in-house, and that saved a significant amount of money. So we're no longer contracting out services. We also added the second shift at the West Concord station. So we have ambulance now 24/7. So bringing the first on in fiscal 15, the second in fiscal 19. And yeah, that's pretty much it. The growth, the big growth is public safety for the ambulance and general administration for the facilities department. So turning next to revenue projections, I went through this in quite a bit of detail with you back in November. There really aren't many changes just yet. What I presented to you back in November was a low revenue scenario or a worst case scenario that resulted in a slight reduction in revenue fiscal 22 to 21 of a decrease of about 0.2% or $245,000. This scenario assumed that new growth would be at 500,000, that there would be a reduction in state aid, significant decreases in local receipts, and no free cash to reduce the tax rate. Back in November, I also presented sort of the best case scenario that would have resulted in about 3.2% growth in revenue over fiscal 21, or about 3.7%. This would assume that new growth would be 900,000, which is similar to what we've seen over the last couple of years. That state aid would be relatively level, mostly with the assumption that we, even in bad years, have not seen a cut to Chapter 70 or education aid. But we really won't know until the governor files his budget at the end of the month. Also, that we would see some of that growth, or recapturing what we had lost in local receipts, assuming that the economy would start opening, we'd receive more in meals tax and rooms tax. And also that we would have $1 million to contribute from free cash to reduce the tax rate, as we have done for the last several years. What I did not show you at that time was a moderate scenario, and that's what I've been working on. And under this scenario, I'm assuming about a 2% growth in revenue overall, or about $2.2 million. And while this would be about 2% growth in revenue, this is revenue to fund the budget in its entirety. So guidelines and fixed costs. If you back out the impact of fixed costs, we're at about 1.5%. But then when you factor in the shift in the CCRSD district enrollment, we're really at about 1.1% available growth for guidelines. So it's not a pretty picture, but we really won't have anything new until we see the governor's budget again at the end of the month.
Yeah, and I think it probably goes without saying that at that rate of increase, costs go up, obviously, in most instances beyond that. So that in some cases can represent a net reduction.
So then you asked about budget drivers, and our budget drivers really aren't any different than what you heard from Jared last week and what you just heard from Bob tonight. The traditional budget drivers, we don't really expect to be as impactful in fiscal 22 as they have been in prior years. We already know what our fiscal 22 retirement assessment is, and it's level. And we knew that because the retirement board voted a 2-year assessment last year. Because of the timing of the budget, we also have our Opeb assessment. And both the retirement and the assessment and the Opeb assessment have been favorably impacted by investment performance and the town's longstanding commitment to fund the annually determined contribution for Opeb. So Bob, I know Bob mentioned health insurance, and I think he said they were maybe projecting no increase. Right now, we, along with Concord Carlisle Regional, are projecting a 6% increase in health insurance. Now, we know that's high. We know that's higher than what the premium renewal will be. But in our case, and also in the district's case, we only have about 2/3 of our eligible employees enrolled in health insurance. So in addition to factoring in the premium renewal increase, we also have to carry something for the potential increase in enrollment for people who are eligible but choose not to enroll for whatever reason. And particularly now with the economy the way it is, I think we feel a little more vulnerable that people who are eligible but aren't enrolled may have a qualifying event and may need to enroll. But we are part of a self-funded health insurance consortium. Our renewal is based on a review of the 2-year loss ratio, and the 2-year loss ratio is very, very favorable. The first 12 months or so of it were favorable, and now with COVID and people's reluctance to seek out medical care, while that's not a good thing, it has a favorable impact on the loss ratio. We also have a growing fund balance at with the consortium. And so we'll have a conversation about whether or not we're going to apply some of that fund balance, which is significantly over the policy recommendation, to offset rates going into fiscal 22. So we do expect a very favorable year as it relates to health insurance renewal. So really, in going into fiscal 22, the main budget driver really is revenue. And I don't think from the town's perspective, we've ever talked to you about revenue being a budget driver, but it certainly is a big concern. Property tax collections are as strong as they've ever been. So we're not really concerned about people becoming delinquent on their property taxes. State aid was level funded in fiscal 21. We're very concerned about there being a decrease, particularly to the unrestricted general fund state aid. We're continue to be concerned about our local excises. Our room occupancy tax through the first 2 quarters is down 70%. Meals tax is doing better, it's only down 40%. Our investment income is down 54% because interest rates are low, and our general fund can only be invested in money markets, and we're not investing general fund in the stock market. If we were, we would be doing well, but what we're limited to, we're seeing a big decrease in our investment income. So, here I have the note about if you back out the what would be set aside for fixed costs, we'd have revenue growth of about 1.59%, and then backing out the shift in the assessment brings it down to 1.12%. Some of the other budget drivers for us are just the continuing effects of COVID-19. You know, going into fiscal 22, are we still going to be in a testing and monitoring mode? Are we going to be involved in vaccine distribution? We certainly hope so. I know Steve Ledoux had mentioned increased utility costs. We're seeing that as well, because on top of having to spread people out, we have people in our buildings for longer hours than we're typically open. We have new air purification systems that we're running. And we do expect that to continue. We're also thinking that we may need to start paying out some vacation time for essential employees. And, you know, these are employees whose work is essential to the COVID-19 pandemic response. So it's not just public safety, it's Board of Health, it's, you know, our Health and Human Services staff. There are a lot of people that aren't traditionally involved in an emergency response that are involved in this one, and they're unable to take vacation time because we're holding them. But at some point, we need to think about paying out vacation potentially. We do expect a request for some increases in the facilities department. Some of this was planned pre-pandemic, where we're looking to add a plumber to our complement of facility staff, but also a result of operational changes necessitated by the COVID-19 protocols. Again, additional cleaning. So there's equipment and there are supplies that are involved in that. And again, as I mentioned, some of this may be offset by a fee for service. With the library expansion, we expect a request for one or more additional FTE to be able to manage the expanded service area. And then in the area of economic vitality, you know, for those of you who have been on the Finance Committee for a couple of years, you know, the former town manager as well as the current town manager have talked to you about economic development and having some capacity within the town organization to help support the business community. So this is something that we had talked about before the pandemic, but now with the pandemic, this is something that's heightened. The business community is hurting. It needs some assistance, and there may be a portion of the budget dedicated to that effort.
If I can comment on that briefly, Carrie.
Sure.
I think one of the things is, you know, obviously we've had to, there did not exist really, or had not existed an economic vitality apparatus within the town organization. It's something that the long range plan and Vision Concord talked about. And it's something I just happen to have a lot of experience with from, you know, throughout my career. And so when the pandemic hit, we basically created one on the fly using existing town staff and existing resources. And I will say I was on a call with some of the businesses today, and the efforts we put into supporting the retailers during the holiday shopping season, I think in a few cases that we heard from, really worked. And so I was really heartened to hear some of the retailers say they had a really good holiday shopping season, which is really essential for them. Holiday shopping season is a big deal for a lot of retailers. Now our focus is on restaurants. January and February are pretty tough months. And so how do we make it really easier for people to get takeout? And one of the things we're doing is reserving parking spaces. But as we develop the FY22 budget, we know we need to have a structured economic vitality apparatus, because it's clear that the recovery is going to extend well past the day that the state of emergency is declared over. And so there's a lot of work ahead of us to support our local businesses, and we intend to build something in the FY22 budget, even with the restrictions that we have from a fiscal standpoint, to be able to help to be able to do that.
Stephen, do you want to take this slide?
Sure. So there's looking ahead of what service staffs anticipate changes are, like I said, we do feel like the next few years are going to be challenging and in some ways uncertain. One of the areas that is going to be more structured is the Affordable Housing Trust. Right now, in the past 2 town meetings, an appropriation has been given to under the auspices of the town manager to help facilitate the development of affordable housing. I think the idea is that the Affordable Housing Trust will eventually take over any unspent portion of those appropriations and then benefit from a revenue stream basically tied to building permit fees that would be collected locally and then put into the Affordable Housing Trust. So that could create some additional operational cost and sort of supporting that effort. Library expansion is something that we know it's going to be a much larger space with more and different types of programming. And so, I think we have some vacant positions at the library that we're going to look at repurposing instead of just layering on. And then we have a transportation advisory committee that's relatively new. And, I think that a focused yet comprehensive place where we can talk about transportation issues, both, literally where the rubber hits the road, but as well as broader policy considerations, will likely generate some projects and responses from the town that may not necessarily expand personnel, but may expand some cost or at least redirect some work. I think the impact until vaccine returns us to normal, we will continue to see impacts on public health, fire, police, facilities, and like I said, the business community. I don't see these ending, certainly in the next, certainly in the next 6 to 12 months, we'll still be in many ways confronting challenges that either we have today or result from. I've used the analogy many times, building the airplane on the fly, which we've been doing now for almost a year during COVID-19. There are parts of that airplane that are going to be more complicated to dismantle than they were to build. And so there are challenges that I am confident lay ahead of us that we're not even aware of yet that are going to result from, unwinding all of the things we had to do to meet the challenge of the pandemic. And as I mentioned before, the state imposed occupancy limits are going to continue, I think, and certainly through the summer. How do we modify our workplace, our work environment to have it be more flexible? Is that going to have an impact on operations? We talked about the vacation time, and I just want to be clear. This is for essential employees. Not having anywhere to go isn't an excuse to carry over vacation time. So most employees will know that they won't be approved for carryover beyond what our policy already allows. And then the other thing is we're in a feasibility study process with the town of Acton for doing a regional dispatch center. Both Carrie and I have firsthand experience in creating and being members of regional dispatch centers. And it's something that the Chief Judge and Chief O'Connor I think are very supportive of, although I don't want to speak for them. I just gave a brief presentation onto the select board Monday night. They're going to get a fuller presentation at an upcoming meeting, but it is something that would have operational considerations. And if we went with a district, then the dispatchers would be employees of a district instead of employees of the 2 towns, which has some moderate, or not really not moderate, some marginal impact on employee costs and Opeb liability. Opeb's not my thing. I'm going to have Carrie do this one.
Sorry, I don't know how I got muted. Our Opeb liability was most recently valued as of June 30 of 2020. The unfunded liability is 38.6 million. It is 35.5% funded, which actually is is lower than I had expected it to be going into the valuation, but the difference is we dropped the discount rate from 7.25% to 6.5%. The actuary did that determined that based on how the funds are invested. So that wasn't something that we agreed to, but I think 6.5% is a much better discount rate to be using anyway. We do value Opeb on an annual basis in accordance to GASB 74 and 75. We have been funding Opeb since fiscal 07, and we have been fully funding the ARC, which is now the ADC, the actuarially determined contribution, since fiscal 09. Because of the delay in the budget schedule, we're actually able to use the 6/30/20 valuation to determine what our fiscal 22 contribution to Opeb will be, which is helpful because typically, because of the cycle that the valuation is prepared, we're typically using data that's about 18 months old. So now we're able to use data that's much fresher. So we have, according to this valuation, we'll be looking to fund $1,611,000 in Opeb this year, which is $111,000 higher than last year. Last year was artificially low, and I think I talked to you about it at that point. I was surprised at what the contribution came out to be, and I think there was an issue with the data. You know, the valuation is only as good as the data that it is being prepared against. So so it is higher, but it's not out of line with what we have been paying over the last several years. We expect the unfunded liability to be fully paid off by 2039. And the table below shows the funding schedule based on the 6/30 valuation. So over here, the liability, we have the normal cost. So this is the value of the benefit that is earned in the current year. The amortization is the value of benefits earned in all of the prior years. So these two together determine the ADC. And then on a funding basis in the valuation, the projected annual benefit cost is the amount that is computed, and it is a combination of the employer share of the premium that we are paying for retirees, plus the value of any benefit that they are using in the current year. And then the required appropriation. So then we come over here to what we actually pay. So the required appropriation or the hard cash payment is $1,715,000. And we calculate what is attributable to the general fund versus what is attributable to the enterprise funds for an annual payment. Now, each year, because we revalue each year, this will change. But again, based on the current valuation, this shows what we estimate to pay out in hard money general fund contribution. Now, it is much higher than you can see we're approaching $500,000 higher. That's our projection for next fiscal year. But a lot of things happen. There could be changes in the assumptions. We could look at changing the discount rate. There could be changes to the benefits that either increase or decrease the liability. And then we have to factor in the investment performance. And so, we are approaching a time where we may actually start seeing a decrease in the required contribution if all things go well. So we are doing very well in terms of our funding towards Opeb. So then you asked us to look at capital. I know you all know we have financial policies, procedures, or practices, as some of you like to refer to them as, that identify our targets for capital spending. So 2 to 3% of the total tax levy should be for operating capital, cash purchases, no more than 5% on debt financed capital. In keeping with these guidelines, the spending targets for fiscal 22 would be a cash outlay of about 1.9 to 2.8 million dollars, that 2 to 3% range, and debt service payments no more than 4.7%. So and I made a note that the debt target is for total debt payments rather than debt authorization. So there's that, I think that's something that is confusing to people. So again, 4.7 million is the total debt service payment that would be within that target. So we do have or make a debt capacity analysis to determine the estimated size of new debt authorizations that can be supported by the target or by the policies and procedures. So based on existing debt service payment commitments and an assumption of a 2.5% increase in property tax revenue, we've determined the following maximum spending can be accommodated for the next 5-year period. So in fiscal 22, new authorizations, a maximum amount of new authorizations of 5.7 million, then 5.4, 5, and 4.6 and 4.3. Now, the reason that there's a decrease in the capacity is there is an assumption that not all projects that are approved are going to be ready to be permanently financed the following year. So while in fiscal 22, we may approve 5.7 million worth of projects, in fiscal 23, we might not be in a position to permanently finance 5.7 million. So maybe we're only able to finance 5 million. And that means my, instead of being at 5% for debt finance capital, maybe I'm at 4.5%. But so those numbers will change, but that's what we're seeing right now for the 5-year plan. I've made a note that in fiscal 21, these spending targets were not met because, as you will recall, we went back and we trimmed our capital plan to account for the fact that we had less revenue and we really had less capacity to advance capital projects.
So Carrie, can I ask a question about when you say if we're within our 5%, but we only really have the wherewithal to engage with 4.5% because those are the projects we can really take on. That extra borrowing authorization is still out there. Do we look at that borrowing authorization and trim our sails in the following year, or do we just go forward with another 5% and say, well, that's just additional borrowing authorization that we've got? I'm just wondering whether there's ever any catch up. I know that from time to time we do rescind a borrowing authorization. It's kind of rare, but it does happen. But would that be a mode we could work with, that if the town meeting authorizes X, but then we don't really do those projects, in the following year, we take the borrowing authorization and kind of like say, that's the starting point, and what else do we need to get to 5% in the following year? Is that, am I thinking of it in the wrong way?
Well, if funding is appropriated for capital projects and we don't do the project in that year, the funding remains with the project. And so you wouldn't, so if the appropriation is sustained, All I'll say about capital is, as Carrie's about to note, that like FY21, FY22, we will be evaluating our project capacity and those targets depending on the overall budget situation. But I think there's really, you say catching up, Dean, I think that's a good way to look at it. You know, deferred maintenance is really just a terrible choice. But it's one that we've had to confront in the last fiscal year and potentially the next one. And so it's, you know, we don't make those types of decisions lightly. And a lot of it is going to be driven by the individual needs of the individual projects and the costs associated with them. So if we put together a package of projects that only adds up to 4.5%, but that's what we feel like is affordable and needed, then that's what we would go with.
So, let me try to put it a slightly different way. Okay. We want to do a certain amount of maintenance. Some of it is expansion of our capital assets, but the majority of it is generally maintenance. And then the year goes by, we get a couple of bumps in the road, and projects that we wanted to do that we did fund, we didn't do because we didn't have the capacity to do them. There were scheduling issues. They didn't get done. So those are projects that have authorization and they need to be done, and they'll be done in a future year. But if things kind of pile up, it's hard to add on an additional 5%, say we'll do these other projects on top of things we didn't get done. Do you understand what I'm saying? In other words, it feels to me like we ought to be kind of making sure that what we're authorizing is stuff that we have the capacity to do, and not just trying to hit a wall of like, hey, let's get 5% in and fill up the bucket. So that's all. I kind of feel like if something drifts into the next year, then that should be the floor of what we're trying to borrow into the next year. That should be added and included as we think about the 5% number. That's just my sense of it, is, you know, you only have so many things balls you can juggle at any one time. That's all. Anyway.
And so that's part of the reason that you see a decrease over time in what the maximum size of the authorization can be, because, you know, in fiscal 26 or in fiscal 25, it's $4.6 million. You know, obviously 5% of the property tax base in fiscal 25 is higher than 5% in fiscal 22, but there's an assumption that not everything that was authorized prior to is ready to be permanently financed. So I have to hold some of that capacity to finance, to make sure I can finance or service the debt associated with those prior projects without exceeding the 5%. I don't know if I'm getting at what you're.
I think we're kind of both talking around the question in slightly different terms, like we're just approaching it from different perspectives. Your concern is that the service number doesn't exceed the 5%. And so if you have to issue debt in a future year for a project that got slightly deferred, you have to keep the service number within our 5%. And my thing is kind of the same question, which is, you know, we only have so much capacity or actual need to get certain things done in any given year, and 5% is kind of the ceiling of what we're looking to do. But if we don't have 5% worth of projects that are really critical or need doing, just to fill up the bucket, just because, oh look, we can build a new park or we can create a new thing, that's kind of where the nice to have versus the necessary is kind of, there's a little gap there that I'm trying to understand how we budget expansions or new stuff as opposed to just keeping the capital assets that we have in good repair and well serviced. So that's and if we just keep saying we have 5% to work with, there's going to be years in which we don't really have that much maintenance to do. So let's just create a new asset for the town. And, you know, that just is money looking for a way to spend it is really my point.
Dean, I hear you on that. All I would tell you is we have a project evaluation process and a project ranking process. And I'm highly confident that the number of requests that are all justified, or at least in many cases are justified, exceed the amount available under those policies.
Okay.
So I can't even envision a scenario where we're going to run out of needs to meet.
Okay, I'll leave it there. I'll just leave it at that, because I think there is a distinction between a need and a nice to have. That's all. And I do think that some of the things that we have been contemplating over the last couple of years are definitely outside the range of need. That's all, you know, and I'll just leave it at that.
So then you had also asked about future capital needs. And I made a note here at the bottom that the town does have substantial capital needs, including the need for a new or substantially improved public safety and public works
Oh,
facility.
yeah. Those
However,
are the big ticket items. I get them.
these projects may be deferred pending the outcome of the middle school feasibility study and subsequent town meeting action. So these are projects that you're well aware of the need, and the timetable at which these move forward really is dependent upon what happens with the middle school.
Well, I guess another way of thinking of that is, can we conserve some of this 5% number in a sense, budgeting it towards a bigger spend on a big ticket item that we need to get? In the event that we're going to go and do a public safety building or another large item, can we slice off a slice of this 5% piece and say it's not all coming out of an exclusion issue. Some of it's coming out of the 5% for a few years, just to get us, maybe it's the equivalent of working a stabilization fund. You're not
Hey,
really.
Dean,
Yeah.
Dean, so can we maybe come back to this one?
Yeah, I'm
'Cause
sorry.
really wanna-
I'm sorry. to
I want to
derail you.
stay off
I
the
am
policy
sorry. It's just
discussion
that-
and more on
Yeah,
guidelines tonight.
It's a little buggy with mine. I'm sorry.
I know,
Get off
I know.
Tangent.
So,
Thank you, Chris.
That's okay.
That's fine.
That's okay. And Carrie, I think on the benchmarking, you have quite a few of these, given that it's kind of 9-10. If there's something in particular that you think you should draw our attention to, please do it, but I'd like to get to questions sooner rather than later, okay?
And I can whip through these pretty quickly anyway. So we did use ClearGov to benchmark, and we're looking at our peer communities of Lincoln, Sudbury, Wellesley, Wayland, Carlisle, Lexington, and Weston. We're using Fiscal 19 data because that is the most recent common data set that is available in ClearGov. So for Fiscal 19, Concord's per capita spending is below the peer communities at $5,446. So here are two areas that we exceed our peers: general administration and finance. So I would note that our general administration includes legal, which was substantially higher in 19 than in prior years. And also the salary reserve is included as an expense in the general administration category. And the salary reserve was also artificially high that year because we were holding money to settle contracts, in some cases, again, we're retro back 2.5 years. In the finance department, we are overspending in comparison with our peers, but a good portion of spending in finance is actually apportioned back to enterprise funds. We do collections for utilities, and we have some pretty big chargebacks, and the chargeback is a revenue. So this is the full expense. but not all of this expense is attributable to the general fund. Here is public safety. Our police expenditure is slightly below the peer average. Our fire expenditure is slightly above, but I did make a note that we run 2 ambulances 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which is not exactly what all of the peer communities do. Here are inspections and public health. And I made a note that we do contract some inspection services out to other departments. So that may be a reason why our spending is higher, because again, the fee for service comes in as a revenue. And this is the full expense, including contracted services. Here are, these are our health and human services categories. Our library spending is higher than peers, but our library is open more hours than libraries in some of the peer communities. And then public works, this is the last slide. We're slightly higher than peers. One of the reasons may be that we do spend a fair amount of money on resurfacing of roads. So our PCI, or pavement condition index, requirement is 80 out of 100. You typically see communities more like 70 to 75. So we have a higher, it's an internal requirement, something that we have a standard that we have set for the community at 80. So that, I think, has something to do with the increased level of spending. So that's it for the review of benchmark.
Very good. Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, Stephen. So we can go to questions now. Let's see, Mary.
Okay, great. Thanks, Carrie and Stephen. I do have questions about some of the details around exactly what we would spend money for economic vitality, and what exactly for facilities we would need extra headcount. But before I get into that detail, I want to look at the high level for a minute. And if I understood you correctly, Carrie, you're saying that at your moderate forecast for revenue, and given the fixed costs, we're left with about 1.12% for guideline spending, which comes out to be about $1 million. And if I look at what we're spending for the contracts, for the labor line, just for the town, that's going to eat up about half of that. So I'm wondering, are there savings other places that are going to make this up, or do we have a serious problem as far as meeting our guideline spending within a 2.5% property tax increase?
Stephen, do you want that, or do you want me to?
Well, I thought that labor was included in the, it was net, labor was net of that 1.12.
No.
No, it wasn't.
No.
Well, like I said, I think, well, I don't know, Carrie, you can give your view, but I don't know that we know enough to say that we're going to have a serious problem. I think that's why Carrie did those 3, low, moderate, and high, because we're still figuring that out.
Well, basically what you've presented to us tonight, and I believe your moderate numbers are pretty reasonable, is that we only have about $1 million to increase guideline spending. And if we don't find savings somewhere else, we are headed for a problem.
So I do think we might see some additional savings in health insurance. Again, because of the later town meeting and the later budget development, we typically will be looking at our health insurance renewal in February. So we'll be able to take that into account this year. And I do expect that the 6% that we're carrying right now, we're going to determine is a little high. I'm hoping that when the governor releases his budget, it's going to be better news for us than even what's projected in the in the moderate scenario.
Are there any other, okay, are there any other savings that we have?
Well, there's also the prospect for federal relief to offset revenue loss. That's something that's been talked about a lot. The CARES Act did not allow for reimbursement of lost revenue. It was explicit that it was only for reimbursement of unbudgeted expenses. So we didn't plan on buying air purifiers and sanitization sprayers. So that's an unbudgeted cost the CARES Act reimbursed us for. Meals taxes have obviously been hit really hard, but CARES Act can't offset that loss of revenue
Right,
in our budget. And
right.
so if you believe if you believe the news that help is on the way in a new administration, there's a possibility that some of those revenue losses could be offset with federal assistance.
Yeah, so Stephen, you also have cap spending to look at yet, right? Which can be an area where savings can be achieved. That's one area I guess they're still working on. They haven't got their budget submissions yet. Would we consider, do you think it's prudent to consider lowering or eliminating the Opeb for 1 year? Is that something that we should think about?
I mean, I guess if I don't want to get, commit to any one course of action or get put on the
Yeah,
spot.
no,
but
I understand. I'm just trying to
but
see what the
I would-
levers are.
I would look at the $1 million to reduce the tax rates
Mhm.
first.
Okay, great.
I would also say, I mean, if we were in desperate situation, the $1 million for tax rate stabilization, I mean, tax collections are high. And so is that an area that we could take a year off and not, disrupt the, not really, overwhelmingly harm individual taxpayers? I think so. The $500,000 we've done each year out of free cash for affordable housing, that need is pressing and gets more expensive every year. But is that something in light of the situation we have and we don't have the approval of the ongoing revenue sources yet from the legislature? Is that something we could look at this year? Potentially. We don't want to look at either of those things, but everything will be on the table if we are in that situation you say. But I guess I'm not worrying about it until we know more detail.
Mhm. Mary.
I am worried about it. I think those are great ideas as far as, maybe deferring the affordable housing for a year, but that impacts free cash. I'm worried about the operating budget right now, and I'll just leave it at that for now.
To answer your other questions about the details.
Yeah.
Like I said, we're at the very beginning. And so we are looking at potentially a plumber. I'm sure if you were tracking the library operating agreement, renewal that we did earlier this year, part of that included a discussion about the town assuming some role in the maintenance of the library, which is all currently contracted out. We think that it would save the corporation some money. And if they made a contribution that was less than they were spending, it would offset the cost to us to hire an additional plumber who would benefit the library. The library get the benefit of the entire facilities division. And then we would have the benefit of having a plumber that could work in other buildings. So on its face, it seemed like a win-win. I'll be honest with you. We were supposed to do that by the end of 2020. And it just didn't happen because of pandemic response. But we are having that conversation with the corporation still. So that could work out. It's an open question as to if we can't work out an agreement with them, are we still going to move forward with the plumber? That's an operational question that we haven't really answered yet. And then in terms of economic vitality, I think one of the things that businesses really let us know a lot was they really were looking for direct financial assistance, and we just did not have we do not have a program set up for that. Many communities do. They have got small business incentive, small business loans. They've got, facade improvement grants. They've got, direct assistance for businesses. And so we would maybe look at a best practice model for something like that. But again, that depends on what the budget situation is. And so I really can't give you a detailed answer on that. There's a lot of need, and we have to do something that makes sense, not only for what our local needs are, but also what our availability of funding is to provide for that.
Anybody else have questions for Stephen or Carrie? Yeah, Phil?
Yes, questions about legal services. So 2 questions. First is about the budget. The second is about the benchmarks. On the budget, so it looks like we're going to exceed the budget for legal services by 100,000 or more. And I understand that part of it is because of preliminary motion that we filed to stop the closure of the Esbrook Road place. But is there a mechanism in place for select board to get a budget for any overages in the legal spending on the lawsuit before they authorize it? And for example, did we get a budget for the preliminary injunction motion? And then the second question is about the benchmarks. I guess we're over our peers in general administration, which includes legal, and is one of the reasons why we're over because of this litigation. Or the legal
I can take the first one. I mean, Carrie puts the information together on the benchmarks, but in terms of the budget, we have an estimate of what, from council, of what they think it will cost. They had an estimate as well for pursuing a preliminary injunction. But on litigation like this, as you well know, it's based on process. And the cost is driven by the iterative process that you're in, whether it's filing motions or responding to communications or a preliminary injunction. And so it's not like like a tort claim with a budget that if you exceed the budget, you've gone over your cost benefit of continuing litigation. It's a land court case about access rights that don't have a quantifiable value. And so there's not really a budgeted amount that makes it going past it not worth doing anymore. And I think that's the challenge of kind of communicating to the town that the litigation costs are, like I said, they're iterative. And so that we do have an estimate, but the select board is committed to preserving the rights of access and continuing the litigate and following this process through to through the trial.
So that it sounds like you did get a budget before you decided to authorize the preliminary injunction motion. But that was my question: is there a process in place for that?
Yeah, Phil. I mean, words are important here. It's an estimate, not a budget. The town council gives us an estimated cost of what they think it's going to be to pursue something. I would add that, like I mentioned at the beginning, we did spend quite a bit of fee to try and avoid pursuing a preliminary injunction, which kind of went into all of that overall spending. But the purpose of all of that was to maintain access to the trail.
Okay.
And then in terms of the benchmarks, I'm not sure about how those are created or what other towns, if it's based, what other towns' numbers are based on, I'll be honest with you.
Yeah, so Carrie, I thought when you mentioned that the general administration was over the other towns, you didn't mention legal services as part of the reason, but I don't know. I was just wondering if that is part of it.
I'm sorry, I did mean to. From my analysis, I believe it's the fact that in fiscal 19 in particular, our legal expenses were much higher than in prior years. And the salary reserve, which is also part of that spending, was much higher because we were carrying amounts to pay retro for contracts that had been unsettled.
Okay.
This question's for either Kerry or Stephen. So in your own internal planning, do you do sort of 3 or 5 year forecasts on revenue and expenditures at some sort of a summary level?
I know I don't. But I think the way I would, and Carrie, I think we do, I think the finance department does look out ahead. I do think when we do budget, we are looking out, trying to find out or try to see what's next. I think the FY21 budget is a perfect example of that. When we presented FY21, we said we think FY22 is going to be worse. This is back in, August when we presented it. And I think that the way things are shaping up, it's likely to be the case. And so we are looking out at like what's ahead, what's next, what contracts are coming up in the next few years, and trying, at least from my perspective, create as much stability in the budget, in really how much we levy and how much we spend in a given year. And so the short answer is not necessarily I'm not a forecaster, but I do know from an operational standpoint, we want to create that level of stability. So we are looking ahead. I can't quantify a number of years, but there are a variety of factors that go into our decision making that are forward looking.
And the
Right. Well,
for me is yes.
go ahead.
List.
Good. Yeah, because it's the same issue for us, right? We're trying to look at what's affordable for the town. And so I'm likely to ask to see some, longer projections, just, because as you mentioned, this is something that will bleed into, future years. So decisions that we're making now, we may want to think about how do we link those to the future to avoid, sort of bumping up and down here, particularly if the budgets are going to be tight for a while.
Yeah. Hey, Carrie, I got a question. On the FTEs for FY21, that's actual fill jobs, right? Not including openings that need to be filled.
No, the FTEs, that's budgeted.
That's budgeted. Okay.
And we're about 15
Short.
of budget. But,
15 vacant.
yeah,
15 vacant.
I have a question for Stephen. When you mentioned you spoke to some business owners regarding economic vitality, so forth, are you looking at areas of centers of business, or just business in general?
I mean, the focus is on our retail districts, downtown, Thoreau Street, West Concord. And so, as opposed to an office complex on Baker Avenue, if that's what you mean, Andrew, if that's the distinction you were looking for. The focus is really on, it really focuses on retailers and restaurants who have been hit really hard, in part because of restrictions on occupancy, but also because of the diminishment of spending capacity in the population. I think Concord's probably done a little better than other communities, but certainly many communities have felt job losses very hard, and so that has been, retailers by extension feel that as well.
So when you mentioned that you I think you felt that businesses were looking for direct money.
Yeah.
My experience has been that for the most part, direct payments are small band-aids and not for the long term. What makes a difference is a business getting like the PPP in the spring, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 to make payroll, rent, which a things you can't really control that well. And I'm not sure the town can afford that kind of big influx of money to help the retailers.
No, I agree with that. I mean, we've been very targeted and very specific in the approaches we've taken to assist local businesses we've used the tools that we have at our disposal. And like I said, I was glad to see that we've gotten some signs that effort, helped. Not everybody, but it helped some, and that's a good thing. I think you're right. I mean, floating a business for 3 months, on the taxpayer's back doesn't make sense. But are there, like I said, and I can tell you from firsthand experience, lots of communities have loan pools and grants, but they're in the 4-digit range generally, not the 6 or 5 or 6 digit range. And so they are kind of a micro level supplement. Like I said, I think that there's many different ways to do that. We just need to look at what's the right way to support our unique mixture of local businesses. But like you said, and the other thing, but protect the taxpayer as well. I mean, there needs to be some security for the taxpayer in whatever we do for local businesses. And I've made that clear from the very beginning. If you've been on any Concord Together or Economic Vitality, conversations about this, when there's been proposals to create give direct assistance to businesses using civil defense authorities, I've said that system doesn't really provide for security for the taxpayers in case of default by the business. And so those are the type, but the programs that exist, most of them have provisions for that kind of protection. And we just have to, like I said, look at the one that's right for us. Interestingly, we did do our town, it's still in draft form, but we did get the data back on our town citizen satisfaction survey. And for the first time, we asked the community about town funds for supporting businesses. And it was a pretty favorable response. I think people, but I don't know that is something that's going to be a long-term part of our budget. So this is, again, we're in a very unique situation, and it calls for unique solutions.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Dee. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Stephen, this is for you. At the beginning, when you opened up, in the beginning, you were talking about, if I understood you correctly, you had level funding for this year. You were looking at level funding with FY21 level. Is that correct?
For discretionary.
That's for discretionary. And what was it? What did you say about for non-discretionary?
Actual.
You wanted just the actual costs, no increase. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, there are, yeah, I mean, if there's increases built in, through
Right.
whatever agreement, but actual as good as we know.
Okay, and so what do you include in discretionary?
I mean, I will say, and Carrie, correct me if I'm wrong, it's significantly the minority of the expenditures. I think most of our budget is non-discretionary, but there are expense line items and things like that for each budget that are discretionary. But I don't know, Carrie, if you know off the top of your head a percentage of what's non-discretionary versus discretionary, but I don't think I think most of it's non.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, so where would the capital expenses fall?
That would be cash capital, both would be discretionary.
Cash capital would be?
Yes,
And what about-
and debt capital would be.
And
as well.
debt, okay.
Yeah, would be as well.
Okay. All right, you didn't, okay, good, thank you.
I think Wade, were you looking to ask a question? No? Okay, Lois?
Yeah, you mentioned there are 15 unfilled positions. And has any thought been given to ranking those positions somehow in level of importance? What I'm asking is there a potential for some savings by making the decision not to fill some of those positions? And has any thought been given to evaluating the impact on the town's ability to deliver services if certain of those positions just are not filled? Because that can end up potentially in creating some savings and giving us a little bit of breathing room here.
It certainly did when we went through that exercise for FY21. So we did go through that. We had a spreadsheet of all the vacant positions. I discussed it with the department heads, or the department heads who had the vacancies. We did the typical red, yellow, green, and blue, depending on the category. And so there were a few positions that were not eliminated, but defunded in light of and we were able to do that because of reduced operational capacity because of the restrictions on the workplaces. How that's going to look in FY22 is too soon to tell, but the exercise you described is exactly what we went through, and we did defund certain positions to meet the number for FY21. And like I said, we will definitely look at it for FY22, but again, what do the workplace restrictions look like? What do the operational needs look like? It's a shifting landscape for that.
Yeah, okay. All right, thank you.
Stephen, this is Prasher. Just one question. Of the is the 15, what's the run rate? In other words, is that a higher, lower rate as a percentage of the total budgeted FTEs
It's
than historically in the last couple of years?
It's about right there. The range is about 5 to 7%, and that was, I think, 6%. And I think that number, Prashar, is in your in the more detailed document that Kerry sent out. That analysis is in there. So I don't want to pull inaccurate numbers off my head, but it's right in that spot.
Okay, thank you.
Stephen, for the upcoming contracts that will expire at the end of 21, do you think you will also potentially look to do 1-year contracts there as well? Is that something that, or you think at this point it will go back to a normal 1 to 3 year or 2 to 3 years?
I think that's also too soon to tell. I know we're going to start talking to you. I mean, the ink is barely dry on some of those agreements, and we're going to start talking to them again, I think, here in the spring. I mean, realistically, until we know if there's going to be additional support from the federal government to offset the revenue losses, and additional support from the state, or a non-reduction in state aid, I don't know that I could commit to one way or the other. And again, I have viewed this all the way along as a mutual benefit for both the collective bargaining unit and the town, because of the uncertainty, and the reason why we were able to get all those, I think, 4 agreements, 4 1-year agreements that were normally 3 years accomplished, was because they read the newspaper too. And so I think that when we come to the bargaining table, I know there's going to be a shared understanding of the position we're in, and we may disagree on what is fair or equitable, but I think we're all going to agree that we're still in it. We're still in this bind, if you will. Like I said, unless something changes from a federal or state level funding wise.
Stephen, I do have a question. On one of the budget drivers was kind of the COVID-19, the contact tracing and the testing and the vaccination. Is there a plan to, I think for public safety, there's a plan to vaccinate town employees, correct? And does that extend, what is the plan?
So I'm glad you asked that, Wade, because I've actually been doing a bit of a PSA at every meeting I've been at to try and, I almost said spread the word virally, but that's a poor choice of words in the context we're in. But the short of it is CDC and then by extension Mass DPH, they are setting the batting order of when who can get vaccinated when. And they are also controlling the distribution and dissemination of the vaccines. So when we stood up our 5-town regional first responder vaccination clinic, which started today, we had to fill out a form that said we have 430 something first responders combined in these 5 towns, and that's police, fire, dispatch, period. I mean, you guys all know this from being in town. Public works workers are first responders in many ways, but they are not eligible for the vaccine in this phase because of the way it's been defined by DPH. And so DPH sent us basically 430 odd doses of vaccine specifically for those people we identified. They're still, they said on Tuesday, here's what we're going to do. You need to have a minimum of 200 first responders to be able to get vaccine to vaccinate first responders. So they say this on Tuesday, and then they say, fill out this application and get it to us by like noon on Thursday with your plan. That's how fast that happened. So I'm guessing the next phases are going to fall kind of the same way, where we're going to find out on a Monday, okay, now you can start vaccinating people over 65, or essential employees that are not first, you can start that on Wednesday. Let us know how many doses you need. I mean, I wish I could tell you that we have the plan, but I just want the community to know it's not up to us. We are following the state's guidelines. They have the vaccines. They give them to us when we meet their criteria. But as soon as we do have a plan, we will let everybody know. And the only thing I will say is I anticipate that the town of Concord, either regionally or individually, will be in the vaccination business for months to come.
And is the state covering that, or are we covering that out of our budget?
The state owns the vaccines, and then whatever costs we incur, whether it's labor cost or the rental of the structure that the clinic is in, that's CARES and or FEMA.
Okay.
And I say CARES and or, it depends on what the expense is.
So Stephen, from a timing perspective, we're supposed to come back together in about a month to go through what your request would be. Understanding that we may not have all answers. Hopefully we'll have information from the governor on his budget. We may not know if there's going to be federal aid or not. Is that timing still going to work? Are we going to have a good discussion in a month on budget?
So for us,
Yeah.
it's not a month, it's about 3 weeks, and it's not,
Okay.
not particularly great for us. But we'll do what we can.
Yeah. If you don't mind hearing, we still don't know a bunch, then we don't mind coming back and telling you that we still don't know a bunch.
Right. Well, I assume, like we're doing now, the best you can do is sort of make some assumptions, right? Lay out the assumptions, make the best assumptions we can. And that's kind of where we are. And so I think that's what we're going to ask both the town and the schools to do, is to make your best assumption and let us know, what's the likelihood, or what, how firm you are in that assumption or not. And then, we'll have to deal with it.
I mean, I think, and I hear what you're saying in that, Chris, and I think that, there are certain things, there are certain assumptions that we can make, but I think, as the superintendent suggested, there are certain assumptions that are not great to make at this early in the state, in the stage, in the process, because if we assume that we're going to have to cut staff, because if X doesn't happen, we assume we're going to have layoffs. That kind of sends a message.
Yes.
And that isn't good to the employees. And then if we find out 2 weeks later, oh, you know what, we didn't actually need to cut staff, it's hard to, so there are certain assumptions that I think we want to hold off as long as possible to make and let the data come in. But there are other things I think we can assume.
Right. Well, we're still going to build a warrant, right? I mean, we have to, right? So we're under the same clock, right? We're all in the same boat. So I understand your point. And, given that this should be, hopefully another maybe 18 months of this, it still feels like a temporary item that we have to absorb. And as you say, there'll be some tail to it, but my hope would be we can figure out a way to do it without cutting services, because my presumption is we're just going to go back to needing those services within some short period of time.
Yeah, I mean, we are fortunate in some ways that we are so reliant on property taxes for the vast majority of our budget, and the property tax collections and the property values, quite honestly, are so strong, and the collections are so strong that, we're not looking at a catastrophic reduction in force. We're really looking at kind of adjustments on the edges, so to speak, because of the revenues. Now they're real. I mean, it's millions of dollars we're talking about here, but not impacting core services. We can insulate core services, and that's a good thing. I mean, I'm sure there were plenty of years that this committee probably says, geez, we're really getting hosed on state aid and we should be getting more. But in time like now, it's a good thing we weren't reliant on it. Because we were able to keep the services going in a way that I think has been pretty good, all things considered, with the way we've had to adjust how we do provide services. So there is definitely a tomorrow. I mean, when I saw that first vaccine get administered today to a first responder, it really was a uplifting thing for me to see this is happening. We're gonna get through this. I just think that from an economic and budgetary standpoint, it's just going to be a little past the public health standpoint.
Yep. Okay. Does anyone else have questions?
I just have one general question for Stephen, probably for Carrie. As I'm trying to get my mind around the I don't know responses, which are perfectly appropriate given all that's going on, it always immediately revert back to, are the I don't knows in line with the expectation of information being delivered to you by the state, which follows, are we still on track for having a feasible town meeting at the date that we've set for it? And so my question is, where are we on that timeline relative to the amount of information that you're receiving? Because the reality is, if we don't have the information to make these informed decisions ahead of town meeting, then should we be pushing town meeting out? So I know that's kind of a radical idea. I'm just trying to understand, where are we in that context?
I so desperately want to resist the temptation to say, I don't know. But I think, so to the first part of your question, the I don't knows do line up with the absence of information from the state. That's correct.
That's okay.
You didn't hear, we don't know if property tax collections are going to be strong. We do know that. So town meeting, as you all know, is currently scheduled for June 6th. I think that's Sunday. I think it's the first Sunday in June 13th. That's like the 10th time I've done that. June 13th. And as we sit here now, Brian, I am confident we'll be able to present a budget that will maintain our operations to the town meeting. Whether or not we make modifications to it between the time it goes into the warrant and the time the motion is made, that we don't know. But I think Chris is right. At some point in time, we're gonna have to publish something. And so
fair enough. I guess I was just really mindful of what is the state doing, and are they having difficulty, and what's the difference in the timeline, if there is one, and if there isn't, that's fine. I wanted to just ask that question.
Yeah, the state. And Carrie, if you disagree with my read of it, please weigh in. But I mean, they just did their FY21 budget, almost right near the end of like in November, I think, right near the end of the legislative session, and they've been trying to deal with a lot of other stuff, and so I have not even heard from our legislative delegation that they're really even starting FY22 yet. Now it's one of those things where all of a sudden we may get an email saying, hey, we're working on it. And we know the governor has announced this is going to be his proposed reduction in state aid. And then we're like, okay, now we can at least put the governor's number into our assumptions and go with that. And that's what generally happens in most towns. You go with the governor's number because the legislature hasn't decided yet. I mean, our hope is that the governor will announce that. He knows that there's a lot of towns that are waiting to publish documents based on that information. I think he's just looking at, I know Carrie's reported this, the hold harmless on state aid for FY21 was funded primarily through reserves at the state level. And so are they going to spend $1.5 billion in reserves to do that again? My guess is probably not. So when the governor announces his budget, then I think you'll see us be able to say, okay, we're going to go with this information and then see what happens. But I don't care. Have you heard from MMA or anybody that they're still working on it?
Well, so the Joint Legislative Committee on Revenue met in December, like they were required to meet. The nice thing is the governor is required to file a budget the third week or the third Wednesday in January. We will plug what he's showing for state aid for Concord into our revenue assumptions, and we might not have anything better until after town meeting. But the nice thing is the governor's assumptions for state aid tend to be the low water mark, and the legislature always seems to do better. So even though the legislature may not approve the budget again until the very end of this fiscal year or into the next fiscal year,
You have a floor.
impact state aid so much.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Appreciate that.
Okay, anybody else? All right, well, I really appreciate the presentation and the time that you took, and I know it's late. And thank you again, and I know we'll see you soon, and you've given us plenty to think about. So I'm sure we'll have many more discussions, but thank you very much, Stephen and Carrie.
Thank you all of you, and thank you for the thank you for the great questions. It's a good dialogue, and we'll see you in a few weeks, I think.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So, all right. So I think we have a lot to think about. So next week, according to our calendar, is when we have a regular meeting, and at that meeting we have other business, but we are to do our preliminary guidelines. So we'll bring you a little bit of data, but it will really be us having a discussion around what do we think we should issue for preliminary guidelines to the schools and to the town for essentially budget growth or spending growth for FY22. So when Mary and Carrie were talking about in Carrie's presentation, she's done the math off the model that we typically use, which I described to you in that presentation a while back. It's our guidelines model. And in there, we make some assumptions about taking prior year base plus new growth, adding on 2.5%, plus the debt exclusion. We hold back somewhere between 4 and 5% of that levy capacity, and we come up with a number. And given her, so that's what the property tax number could be. And that number plus what we have for other revenue, which is where she was doing the scenario planning on what might we see for reductions in local excise, state, and so forth. That gives us, and we subtract from that our fixed costs, which is debt service, Minuteman assessment, et cetera. And that gives us with what we have left for the guideline spending growth to be. And if you do it off the moderate assumptions that she made on revenue, and you still include $1 million out of free cash, which we're going to need to talk about as to whether we want to do that or not, you're left with somewhere around 1% once you deduct for the high school's movement in enrollment, which will cost another $500,000, really through no no spending issue on terms of the school. It just is going to cost another $500,000. And last year, we sort of took that off the top. We can talk about that too. But we don't, we have some information from the towns. We didn't get a lot yet from the schools, right? We have prior year information, but we didn't get as much forward-looking information as we did tonight from the towns and from Minuteman. So it's going to be, I think we're going to have to make some assumptions, but we're really, talking about what do we think is going to be necessary. I agree with Stephen. I don't think for a temporary dip in revenues, you go after cutting services in order to meet the budget. I think we're going to have to pull some other levers, whether it's use of free cash or not use of free cash or other reserves that we have, potentially changing that levy limit capacity, but that'll hit property taxes. That means you're going to raise property taxes more than we have been. We've been in the 2 to 3% range the last couple of years. So that's what the dialogue is going to be. If others want to weigh in, Mary.
Yeah, I think at this point in the process, we're usually at the point where we're trying to, it's normal for us to be trying to stuff, 7 pounds of sugar in a 5-pound bag. This year, it feels like we're trying to stuff 10 pounds of sugar in a 5-pound bag. And we're going to have to do a little bit of I think some of the things Chris said are great. We've got some creative things we may want to do. We don't want to cut services because whatever we're going through now is temporary, but we may want to, decrease the Opeb, dip into free cash and think of some other conservative things. But I did want to make one comment, Chris, before we go, which is at the end of our last guideline meeting, we were talking about simplifying the presentation by the schools so that we could kind of get simpler metrics so that we could make better judgments and give better guidance to the schools. And I did reach out to Court Booth, who's many of you know is the chair of the school committee, to ask if he had any ideas about how they look at what metrics they look at or how we could work together to support them when they look at the budget. And we throw around a bunch of ideas, but we basically disqualified most of them. But one thing he did say is that looking at the contract for the teachers is a great way to understand the budget drivers. And those contracts are available on the school's website. So I invite anybody who really wants to understand what's driving the school budget to take a closer look at those contracts, since that's gonna, just as one point of reference, 46 cents on every dollar that we pay in property taxes because of instruction at the schools. So it's a huge budget driver overall. So I just wanted to throw that out. If anybody's interested, take a look at those contracts so that we can understand better what we're dealing with. Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, good. Anybody have anything else? Not, I will take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Okay, I'll do a roll call vote. Mary Hartman,
Let's go. Yes.
Chris Reynolds, yes. Dee Ortner,
Yes.
Dean Banfield,
Yes.
Ray Andrews,
Yes.
Wade Rubenstein. I think
Yes.
you said yes. Lois Bossoff,
Yes.
Greg Gorello,
Yes.
Parashar Patel,
Yes.
Dick Jameson,
Yes.
Phil Swain,
Yes.
John Hickling,
Yes.
Brian Taylor. Brian Taylor, yes? Looks yes. Andrea Zoll,
Yes.
Yes.
okay. I think I got everybody, so I think we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay,
Good
bye-bye.
night.
Good night.